In the church of St. Barnaby, vespers were over. The clergy left the altar, and the little choir boys flocked across the chancel and settled in the stalls. My chair was near the chancel rail. I now turned towards the west end of the church. The other people between the altar and the pulpit turned too. There was a little scraping and rustling while the congregation seated itself again. The Monsignor mounted the pulpit stairs, and the organ ceased. I'd always found the organ playing at St. Barnaby highly interesting. Today, however, from the first chord I'd felt a change for the worst. A sinister change. During Vespers it had been chiefly the chancel organ which supported the beautiful choir, but now and again, quite wantedly, as it seemed, from the west end of the gallery where the great organ stands, a heavy hand had struck across the church at a serene pace of those clear voices. It was something more than harsh and dissident, and it betrayed no lack of skill. As it reoccurred again and again, it set me to thinking what my architect's book said about the custom in early times to consecrate the choir as soon as it was built, and that the nave, being finished sometimes half a century later, often didn't get any blessing at all. I wondered, idly, if this had been the case at St. Barnaby, and whether something not usually supposed to be at home in a Christian church might have entered undetected and taken possession of the West Gallery. But then I remembered that St. Barnaby was not much more than 100 years old, and I smiled at the incongruous association with medieval superstitions. But now Vespers were over, and there should have followed a few quiet chords, fit to accompany meditation, while we waited for the sermon. Instead of that, the discord at the lower end of the church broke out with the departure of the clergy, as if nothing could now control it. I belong to those children of an older, simpler generation who refuse to find in music anything more than a melody and harmony. But I felt, in that labyrinth of sounds that were now issuing from that instrument, that something was being hunted. Up and down the pedals chased him, whilst the manuals blared approval. My nervous annoyance changed to anger. Well, who was doing this? And how dare he play like that in midst of a divine service? I glanced at the people near me. Not one of them appeared to be at least a bit disturbed. The placid brows of the kneeling nuns, still turned towards the altar, lost none of their devout abstraction under the pale shadow of their white headdress. The fashionable lady beside me was looking expectantly at the Monsignor. For all her face betrayed, the organ might have been singing Ave Maria. But now, at last, the preacher made the sign of the cross and commanded silence. I turned to him gladly. Thus far, I'd not found the rest I'd counted on when entering St. Barnaby that afternoon. I was worn out by 3 nights of physical suffering and mental trouble, and the last had been the worst. It was an exhausted body, and a mind benumbed and yet acutely sensitive, which I had brought to my favourite church for healing. The Monsignor delivered his text in a calm voice, glancing quietly over the congregation. My eyes turned, I know not why, towards the lower end of the church. The organist was coming out from behind the pipes, and passing along the gallery on his way out. I saw him disappear by a small door that leads down some stairs which descend directly onto the street. He was a slender man, and his face was as white as his coat was black. Good riddance, I thought, with your wicked music. I hope your assistant will be there to play the closing piece. With a feeling of relief, With a deep, calm feeling of relief, I turned back to the mild face in the pulpit and settled myself to listen. Here at last was the ease of mind I longed for. "My children," said the preacher, "one truth the human soul finds hardest of all to learn is that there is nothing to fear. It can never be made to see that nothing can really harm it." Curious doctrine, I thought, for a Catholic priest. Let us see how he'll reconcile that with the Fathers. "Nothing can really harm the soul," he went on in his coolest and clearest of tones, "because—" But I never heard the rest. My eye left his face, I know not for what reason, and sought the lower end of the church. The same man was coming out from behind the organ and was passing along the gallery the same way. But there had not been time for him to return, and if he had returned, I must have seen him. I felt a faint chill, and my heart sank. Yet his going and coming was of no affair of mine. I looked at him. I could not look away from his black figure and his white face. When he was exactly opposite me, he turned and sent across the church straight into my eyes a look of hate, so intense and deadly. I'd never seen anything like it. Would to God I might never see anything again. Then he disappeared by the same door which I'd watched him depart less than 60 seconds before. I sat and tried to collect my thoughts. My first sensation was that of a young child badly hurt when it catches its breath before crying out. To suddenly find myself the object of such hatred was exquisitely painful. And this man was an utter stranger. Why should he hate me so? Me, whom he had never seen before? Well, for a moment all other sensation was merged into this one pang. Even fear was subordinate to grief, and for a moment I never doubted. But in the next I started to reason, and a sense of incongruous came to my aid. As I have said, St. Barnaby is a modern church. It is small and well lit. One sees all over it in almost a glance. The organ gallery gets a strong white light from the row of long windows in the clerestory, which have not even coloured glass. The pulpit, being in the middle of the church, it followed that if I was to turn towards it, whatever moved in the west end I could not fail to be attracted by. When the organist passed, it was no wonder I saw him. I had simply miscalculated the interval between his first and second passing. He had come in the last time by the other side door. Well, as for the look which he gave me, which so upset me, there was no such thing. I was a nervous fool. I looked about. Well, this is a likely place to harbour supernatural horrors. That clear-cut, reasonable face of the Monseigneur, his collected manner and ease of graceful gestures, were they not just a little discouraging of the notion of some gruesome mystery? I glanced above his head, and almost laughed. The fly-away lady supporting one corner of the pulpit canopy, which looked like a fringed damask tablecloth in light wind. Well, the first attempt of a basilisk to pose up there in the organ loft, she would have pointed her trumpet at him and puffed him out of existence. I laughed to myself over this conceit, which at the time I thought was amusing, and sat and chaffed to myself over that and everything else, from the old harpy outside the railing who had made me pay 10 centimes for my chair before she would allow me in. She was more like a basilisk, I told myself, than was the organist with the anaemic complexion. From that grim old dame to, yes, alas, the Monseigneur himself, for all devoutness, had fled. I had never done such a thing in my life, but now I felt the desire to mock. As for the sermon, I could not hear a word of it. It was no use to sit here any longer. I must get outdoors and shake myself free of this hateful mood. I knew the rudeness I was committing, but still. I rose and left the church. A spring sun was shining on the Rue Saint-André as I ran down the church steps. On one corner stood a barrow full of yellow jonquils, pale violets from the Riviera, dark Russian violets and white Roman hyacinths, in a golden cloud of mimosa. The street was full of Sunday pleasure seekers. I swung my cane and laughed with the rest. Someone overtook and passed me. He never turned, but there was the same deadly malignant in his white profile that there had been in his eyes. I watched him as long as I could see him. His lithe black expression the same menace. Every step that carried him away from me seemed to bear him on some errand connected with my destruction. I was creeping along, my feet almost refusing to move. There began to dawn on me a sense of responsibility for something long forgotten. It began to seem as if I deserved that which he was threatening. It reached a long way back. A long way back. It had lain dormant all these years. It was there, though. And presently it would rise and confront me. But I would try to escape, and I stumbled as best as I could into the Rue de Rivoli, across the Place de la Concorde, and onto the quay. I looked with sick eyes upon the sun, shining through the white foam of the fountain, pouring over the backs of the dusky bronze river gods. On the far-away arc, a structure of amethyst mist, on the countless vistas of grey stems and bare branches faintly green. Then I saw him again, coming down one of the chestnut alleys of the Cours Lorraine. I left the riverside, plunged blindly across the Champs-Élysées, and turned towards the Arc. The setting sun was sending its rays along the green sward of the Rond-Point. In the full glow he sat on a bench, children and young mothers all about him. He was nothing but a Sunday lounger, like the others, like myself. I said the words almost aloud, and all the while I gazed upon the malignant hatred of his face. But he was not looking at me. I crept past and dragged my laden feet up on the avenue. I knew that every time I met him brought me nearer to the accomplishment of his purpose and my fate. And still I tried to save myself. The last rays of the sunset were pouring through the great arc. I passed under it and met him face to face. I'd left him far down on the Champs-Élysées, and yet he came through with a stream of people who were returning from the Bois de Boulogne. He came so close to me that he brushed me. His slender frame felt like iron against the loose black covering. He showed no sign of haste, nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing: the will and power to work me evil. In anguish, I watched him where he went down the broad, crowded avenue that was all flashing with wheels and trappings of horses and helmets of the Garde Républicaine. He was soon lost to sight. Then I turned and fled into the Bow, and far out beyond it, I know not where I went, but after a long while, as it seemed to me, night had fallen, and I found myself sitting on a table before a small cafe. I had turned and wandered back into the Bow. It was hours now since I had last seen him. Physical fatigue and mental suffering had left me with no power to think or feel. I was tired. So tired. I longed to hide away in my own den. I resolved to go home. But that was a long way off. I live in the Court of the Dragon, a narrow passageway that leads from the Rue de Rennes to the Rue de Dragon. It is an impasse, traversable only for foot passengers. Over the entrance of the Rue de Rennes is a balcony, supported by an iron dragon. Within the court, tall old houses rise on either side, and close the ends that give to the two streets. Huge gates swung back during the daytime into the walls of the deep archways close this court after midnight, and one must enter then by ringing certain small doors on the side. Steep stairways pitch down to the doors that open onto the court. The ground floors are occupied by shops of second-hand dealers and by ironworkers. All day long the place rings with the clink of hammers and the clang of metal bars. Unsavoury as it is below, there is a cheerfulness and comfort and hard, honest work above. 5 flights up are the entellers of architects and painters, and the hiding place of middle-aged students like myself who want to live alone. When I first came here to live, I was young and not alone. I had to walk a while before any conveyance appeared, but at last, when I'd almost reached the Arc de Triomphe again, an empty cab came along and I took it. From the Arc to the Rue de Rennes is a drive of more than half an hour, especially when one is conveyed by a tired cab horse that has been at the mercy of Sunday fate-makers. There had been time before I passed under the dragon's wings to meet my enemy over and over again, but I never saw him once. And now refuge was close at hand. Before the wide gateway, a small mob of children were playing. Our concierge and his wife walked among them with their black poodle, keeping order. Some couples were waltzing on the sidewalk. I returned their greetings and hurried in. All the inhabitants of the court had trooped out into the street. The place was quite deserted. My apartment was at the top of a house, halfway down the court, reached by a staircase that descended almost into the street, with only a bit of passageway intervening. I set my foot on the threshold of the open door. The friendly old ruinous stairs rose before me, leading up to rest and shelter. Looking back over my right shoulder, I saw him 10 paces off. He must have entered the court with me. He was coming straight on, neither slowly nor swiftly, but straight on to me. And now he was looking for me. For the first time since our eyes encountered across the churchway, they met again now. And I knew that the time had come. Retreating backward down the court, I faced him. I meant to escape by the entrance down on the Rue de Dragon. His eyes told me that I should never escape. It seemed ages whilst we were going. I retreated, he advancing, down the court in perfect silence. But then, at last, I felt a shadow of the archway, and the next step brought me within it. I had meant to turn here and spring forward into the street, but the shadow was not that of the archway. It was that of the vault. The great doors on the Rue de Dragon were closed. I felt this by the blackness which now surrounded me. and at the same instant, I read it in his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer. The deep vaults of the huge closed doors, their cold iron clamps were all on his side. The thing which he had threatened had arrived. It gathered and bore down on me from the fathomless shadows to the point at which it would strike his internal eyes. Hopeless, I set my back against the barred doors and defied him. There was a scraping of chairs on the stone floor, and a rustling as the congregation rose. I could hear the Suse's staff in the south aisle preceding the Monsignor to the sacristy. The kneeling nuns roused from their devout abstraction, made their reverence, and went away. The fashionable lady, my neighbour, rose also, with graceful reserve. As she departed, her glance just flitted over my face with disapproval. Half dead, or so it seemed to me, yet intensely alive to every trifle, I sat among the leisurely moving crowd, and then rose too, and went toward the door. I had slept through the sermon. Had I slept through the sermon? I looked up and saw him passing along the gallery to his place. Only his side I saw. The thin, bent arm of his black covering looked like one of those devilish, nameless instruments which lie in the disused torture chambers of medieval castles. But I had escaped him, though his eyes said I should not. Had I escaped him? That which gave him power over me came back out of the oblivion where I had hoped to keep it. For I knew him now. Death, and the awful abode of lost souls, whither my weakness long ago and sent him. They had changed him for every other eye, but not for mine. I had recognized him from almost the first. I had never doubted what he came to do. And now I knew, while my body sat safe in the cheerful little church, he had been hunting my soul in the court of the dragon. I crept to the door. The organ broke out overhead with a blare. A dazzling light filled the church, blotting the altar from my eyes. The people faded away. The arches and the vaulted roof vanished. I raised my seared eyes and to the fathomless glare and saw the black stars hanging in the heavens. And now I heard his voice, rising and swelling, thundering through the flaring light, and as I fell, the radiance increasing and increasing poured over me with waves of flame.